On the Western Circuit by Thomas Hardy. The man who played the disturbing part in the two quiet feminine lives here under depicted, no great man in any sense, by the way, first had knowledge of them on an October evening in the city of Melchester. He had been standing in the close, vainly endeavoring to gain amid the darkness a glimpse of the most homogeneous pile of medieval architecture in England, which towered and tapered from the damp and level sward in front of him. While he stood, the presence of the cathedral walls was revealed rather by the ear than by the eyes. He could not see them, but they reflected sharply a roar of sound which entered the close by a street leading from the city square, and, falling upon the building, was flung back upon him. He postponed till the morrow his attempt to examine the deserted edifice, and turned his attention to the noise. It was compounded of steam barrel organs, the clanging of gongs, the ringing of handbells, the clack of rattles, and the undistinguishable shouts of men. A lurid light hung in the air in the direction of the tumult. Thitherward he went, passing under the arched gateway, along a straight street, and into the square. He might have searched Europe over for a greater contrast between juxtaposed scenes. The spectacle was that of the eighth chasm of the Inferno as to color and flame, and as to mirth, a development of the Homeric heaven. A smoky glare of the complexion of brass filings ascended from the fiery tongues of innumerable naphtha lamps affixed to booths, stalls, and other temporary erections, which crowded the spacious market square. In front of this iridescence, scores of human figures, more or less in profile, were darting athwart and across, up, down, and around, like gnats against the sunset. Their motions were so rhythmical that they seemed to be moved by machinery, and it presently appeared that they were moved by machinery indeed, the figures being those of the patrons of swings, seesaws, flying leaps, above all, of the three steam roundabouts, which occupied the centre of the position. It was from the latter that the din of steam organs came. Throbbing humanity in full light was on second thoughts better than architecture in the dark. The young man, lighting a short pipe and putting his hat on one side and one hand in his pocket to throw himself into harmony with his new environment, drew near to the largest and most patronized of steam circuses, as the roundabouts were called by their owners. This was one of brilliant finish, and it was now in full revolution. The musical instrument, around which and to whose tones the riders revolve, directed its trumpet mouths of brass upon the young man, and the long plate glass mirrors set at angles, which revolved with the machine, flashed the gyrating personages and hobby horses kaleidoscopically into his eyes. It could now be seen that he was unlike the majority of the crowd, a gentlemanly young fellow, one of the species found in large towns only, and London particularly, built on delicate lines. Well, though not fashionably dressed, he appeared to belong to the professional class. He had nothing square or practical about his look, but that was linear and sensuous. Indeed, some would have called him a man not altogether typical of the middle-class male of a century wherein sordid ambition is the master passion that seems to be taking the time-honored place of love. The revolving figures passed before his eyes with an unexpected and quiet grace in a throng whose natural movements did not suggest gratefulness or quietude as a rule. By some contrivance there was imparted to each of the hobby horses a motion which was really the triumph and perfection of roundabout inventiveness, a galloping rise and fall, so timed that of each pair of steeds one was on the spring while the other was on the pitch. The riders were quite fascinated by these equine undulations in the most delightful holiday game of our times. There were riders as young as 6 and as old as 60 years, and every age between. At first it was difficult to catch a personality, but by and by the observer's eyes centered on the prettiest girl out of the several pretty ones revolving. It was not that one with the light frock and light hat whom he had been at first attracted by. No, it was the one with the black cape, grey skirt, light gloves, and no, not even she, but the one behind her, she with the crimson skirt, dark jacket, brown hat, and brown gloves. Unmistakably, that was the prettiest girl. Having finally selected her, this idle spectator studied her as well as he was able during each of her brief transits across his visual field. She was absolutely unconscious of everything save the act of riding. Her features were wrapped in an ecstatic dreaminess for the moment. She did not know her age or her history or her lineaments, much less her troubles. He himself was full of vague latter-day glooms and popular melancholies, and it was a refreshing sensation to behold this young thing then and there, absolutely as happy as if she were in paradise. Dreading the moment when the inexorable Stoker grimly lurking behind the glittering... Let's try that again. Dreading the moment when the inexorable Stoker, grimly lurking behind the glittering rococo work, should decide that this set of riders had had their pennyworth, and bring the whole concern of steam engine horses, mirrors, trumpets, drums, cymbals, and such like, to pause in silence, he waited for her every reappearance, glancing indifferently over the intervening forms, including the 2 plainer girls, the old woman and child, the 2 youngsters, the newly married couple, the old man with a clay pipe, the sparkish youth with a ring, the young ladies in the chariot, the pair of journeymen carpenters and others, till the select country beauty followed on again in her place. He had never seen a fairer product of nature, and each round she made a deeper mark in his sentiments. The stoppage then came, and the sights of the riders were audible. He moved round to the place at which he reckoned she would alight, but she retained her seat. The empty saddles began to refill, and she plainly was deciding to have her another turn. The young man drew up to the side of her steed and pleasantly asked her if she had enjoyed her ride. "Oh, yes," she said, with dancing eyes. "It has been quite unlike anything I have ever felt in my life before." It was not difficult to fall into conversation with her. Unreserved, too unreserved by nature, She was not experienced enough to be reserved by art. And after a little coaxing, she answered his remarks readily. She had come to live in Melchester from a village on the Great Plain, and this was the first time that she had ever seen a steam circus. She could not understand how such wonderful machines were made. She had come to the city on the invitation of Mrs. Harnham, who had taken her into her household to train her as a servant, if she showed any aptitude. Mrs. Harnham was a young lady who, before she married, had been Miss Edith White, living in the country near the speaker's cottage. She was now very kind to her, through knowing her in childhood so well. She was even taken the trouble to educate her. Mrs. Harnham was the only friend she had in the world, and being without children, had wished to have her near her in preference to anybody else, though she had only lately come, allowed her to do almost as she liked, and to have a holiday whenever she asked for it. The husband of this kind young lady was a rich wine merchant of the town, but Mrs. Harnham did not care much about him. In the daytime you could see the house from where they were talking. She, the speaker, liked Melchester better than the lonely country, and she was going to have a new hat for next Sunday that was to cost 15 and 9 pence. Then she inquired of her acquaintance where he lived, and he told her in London, that ancient and smoky city, where everybody lived who lived at all, and died because they could not live there. He came into Wessex 2 or 3 times a year for professional reasons. He had arrived from Wintoncester yesterday, and was going on into the next county in a day or 2. For one thing, he did like the country better than the town, and it was because it contained such girls as herself. Then the pleasure machine started again, and to the light-hearted girl, the figure of the handsome young man, the market square with its lights and crowds, the houses beyond, and the world at large began moving around as before, counter-moving in the revolving mirrors on her right hand, she being, as it were, the fixed point in an undulating, dazzling, lurid universe, in which loomed forward most prominently of all the form of her late interculator. Each time that she approached the half of her orbit that lay nearest him, they gazed at each other with smiles, and with that unmistakable expression which means so little at the moment, yet so often leads up to passion. Heartache, union, disunion, devotion, overpopulation, drudgery, content, resignation, despair. When the horses slowed anew, he stepped to her side and proposed another heat. "Hang the expense for once," he said. "I'll pay." She laughed till the tears came. "Why do you laugh, dear?" said he. "Because you are so genteel that you must have plenty of money, and only say that for fun," she returned. "Ha ha!" laughed the young man in unison, and gallantly producing his money, she was enabled to whirl on again. As he stood smiling there in the motley crowd, with his pipe in his hand, and clad in the rough pea-jacket and wide awake that he had put on for his stroll, Who would have supposed him to be Charles Bradford Ray, Esquire, stuff gownsman, educated at Wintoncester, called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn, now going the Western Circuit, merely detained in Melchester by a small arbitration after his brethren had moved on to the next county town. 2. The square was overlooked from its remoter corner by the house of which the young girl had spoken, a dignified residence of considerable size, having several windows on each floor. Inside one of these, on the first floor, the apartment being a large drawing-room, sat a lady in appearance from 28 to 30 years of age. The blinds were still undrawn, and the lady was absently surveying the weird scene without her cheek. The blinds were still undrawn, and the lady was absently surveying the weird scene without, her cheek resting on her hand. The room was unlit from within, but enough of the glare from the market-place entered it to reveal the lady's face. She was what is called an interesting creature, rather than a handsome woman, dark-eyed, thoughtful, and with sensitive lips. A man sauntered into the room from behind and came forward. "Oh, Edith, I didn't see you," he said. "Why are you sitting here in the dark?" "I'm looking at the fair," replied the lady in a languid voice. "Oh, horrid nuisance every year. I wish it could be put a stop to." "I like it." There's no accounting for taste." For a moment he gazed from the window with her, for politeness' sake, and then went out again. In a few minutes she rang. "Hasn't Anna come in?" asked Mr. Harnham. "No. She ought to be in by this time. I meant her to go for 10 minutes only. Shall I go and look for her, said the host maid alertly. "No, it is not necessary. She is a good girl and will come home soon." However, when the servant had gone, Mrs. Harnham arose, went up to her room, cloaked and bonneted herself, and proceeded downstairs, where she found her husband. "I want to see the fair," she said, "and I'm going to look for Anna. I have made myself responsible for her, and must see she comes to no harm. She ought to be indoors. Will you come with me?" "Oh, she's all right. I saw her on one of those whirligig things, talking to her young man as I came in. But I'll go if you wish, though I'd rather go 100 miles the other way." "Then please do so. I shall come to no harm alone." She left the house and entered the crowd which thronged the market-place, where she soon discovered Anna, seated on the revolving horse. As soon as it stopped, Mrs. Harnham advanced and said severely, "Anna, how can you be such a wild girl? You were only to be out for 10 minutes." Anna looked blank, and the young man, who had dropped into the background, came to help her alight. "Please don't blame her," he said politely. "It is my fault that she has stayed. She looked so graceful on the horse that I induced her to go round again. I assure you that she has been quite safe." "In that case, I'll leave her in your hands," said Mrs. Harnham, turning to retrace her steps. But this, for the moment, it was not so easy to do. Something had attracted the crowd to a spot in their rear, and the wine merchant's wife, caught by its sway, found herself pressed against Anna's acquaintance, without power to move away. Their faces were within a few inches of each other. His breath fanned her cheek as well as Anna's. They could do no other than smile at the accident, but neither spoke, and each waited passively. Mrs. Harnham then felt a man's hand clasping her fingers, and from the look of consciousness on the young fellow's face, he knew the hand to be his. She also knew that from the position of the girl he had no other thought than that the imprisoned hand was Anna's. What prompted her to refrain from undeceiving him she could hardly tell. Not content with holding the hand, he playfully slipped two of his fingers inside her glove, against her palm. Thus matters continued till the pressure lessened, but several minutes passed before the crowd thinned sufficiently to allow Mrs. Harnham to withdraw. How did they get to know each other, I wonder? She mused as she retreated. Anna is really very forward, and he very wicked and nice. She was so gently stirred with the stranger's manner and voice, with the tenderness of his idle touch, that instead of re-entering the house, she turned back again and observed the pair from a screened nook. Really, she argued, being little less impulsive than Anna herself, it was very excusable in Anna to encourage him. However, she might have contrived to make his acquaintance. He was so gentlemanly, so fascinating, that had such beautiful eyes. The thought that he was several years her junior produced a reasonless sigh. At length the couple turned from the roundabout towards the door of Mrs. Harnham's house, and the young man could be heard saying that he would accompany her home. Anna, then, had found a lover, apparently a very devoted one. Mrs. Harnham was quite interested in him. When they drew near the door of the wine merchant's house, a comparatively deserted spot by this time, they stood invisible for a little while in the shadow of a wall, where they separated, Anna going on to the entrance, and her acquaintance returning across the square. Anna, said Mrs. Harnham, coming up, I've been looking at you. That young man kissed you at parting, I'm almost sure. Well, stammered Anna, he said, if I didn't mind, it would do me no harm, and him a great deal of good. Ah, I thought so. And he was a stranger till tonight? Yes, ma'am. Yet, I warrant you told him your name and everything about yourself? He asked me. But he didn't tell you his? Yes, ma'am, he did, cried Anna victoriously. It is Charles Bradford of London. Well, if he's respectable, of course I've nothing to say against you knowing him, remarked her mistress, prepossessed in spite of general principles in the young man's favor. But I must reconsider all that if he attempts to renew your acquaintance. A country-bred girl like you, who has never lived in Melchester till this month, who had hardly ever seen a black-coated man till you came here, to be so sharp as to capture a young Londoner like him. I didn't capture him. I didn't do anything, said Anna in confusion. When she was indoors and alone, Mrs. Harnham thought what a well-bred and chivalrous young man Anna's companion had seemed. There had been a magic in his wooing touch of her hand, and she wondered how he had come to be attracted by the girl. The next morning, the emotional Edith Harnham went to the usual weekday service in Melchester Cathedral. In crossing the close through the fog, she again perceived him who had interested her the previous evening, gazing up thoughtfully at the high-piled architecture of the nave, and as soon as she had taken her seat, he entered and sat down in a stall opposite hers. He did not particularly heed her, but Mrs. Harnham was continually occupying her eyes with him, and wondered more than ever what had attracted him in her unfledged maidservant. The mistress was almost as unaccused. The mistress was almost as unaccustomed as the maiden herself to the end of the aged young man, or she might have wondered less. Ray, having looked about him while, left abruptly without regard to the service that was proceeding, and Mrs. Harnham, lonely, impressionable creature that she was, took no further interest in praising the Lord. She wished she had married a London man who knew the subtleties of love-making, as they were evidently known to him who had mistakenly caressed her hand. III. The calendar at Melchester had been light, occupying the court only a few hours, and the assizes at Casterbridge, the next county town on the western circuit. Having no business for Ray, he had not gone thither. At the next town after that, they did not open till the following Monday, trials to begin on Tuesday morning. In the natural order of things, Ray would have arrived at the latter place on Monday afternoon, but it was not till the middle of Wednesday that his gown and grey wig, curled in tiers, in the best fashion of Assyrian bas-reliefs, were seen blowing and bobbing behind him as he hastily walked up the High Street from his lodgings. But though he entered the assize building, there was nothing for him to do, and sitting at the blue baize table in the well of the court, he mended pens with a mind far away from the case in progress. Thoughts of unpremeditated conduct, of which a week earlier he would not have believed himself capable, threw him into a mood of dissatisfied depression. He had contrived to see again the pretty rural maiden Anna, the day after the fair, had walked out of the city with her to the earthworks of Old Melchester, and feeling a violent fancy for her, had remained in Melchester all Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, by persuasion, obtaining walks and meetings with the girl 6 or 7 times during the interval, had, in brief, won her body and soul. He supposed it must have been owing to the sudden seclusion in which he had lived of late in town, and he had given way so unrestrainedly to a passion for an artless creature whose inexperience had, from the first, led her to place herself unreservedly in his hands. Much he deplored trifling with her feelings for the sake of a passing desire, and he could only hope that she might not live to suffer on his account. She had begged him to come to her again, entreated him, wept. He had promised that he would do so, and he meant to carry out the promise. He could not desert her now. Awkward as such unintentional connections were, the interspace of 100 miles, which to a girl of her limited capabilities was like 1,000, would effectually hinder this summer fancy from greatly encumbering his life, while thought of her simple love might do him the negative good of keeping him from idle pleasures in town when he wished to work hard. His circuit journeys would take him to Melchester 3 or 4 times a year, and then he could always see her. The pseudonym, or rather partial name, that he had given her as his before, knowing how far the acquaintance was going to carry him, had been spoken on the spur of the moment, without any ulterior intention whatever. He had not afterwards disturbed Anna's error, but not on leaving her he had felt bound to give her an address at the stationer's not far from his chambers, at which she might write to him under the initials C.B. In due time Ray returned to his London abode, having called at Melchester on his way and spent a few additional hours with his fascinating child of nature. In town he lived monotonously every day. Often he and his rooms were enclosed by a tawny fog from all the world besides, and when he lighted the gas to read or write by, his situation seemed so unnatural that he would look into the fire and think of that trusting girl at Melchester again and again. Often oppressed by absurd fondness for her, he would enter the dim, religious nave of the law courts by the north door, elbow other juniors, habited like himself, and like him, unretained, edge himself into this or that crowded court where a sensational case was going on, just as if he were in it, though the police officers at the door knew as well as he knew himself that he had no more concern with the business in hand than the patient idlers at the gallery door outside, who had waited to enter since 8 in the morning, because, like him, they belonged to the classes that live on expectation. But he would do these things to no purpose, and think how greatly the characters in such scenes contrasted with the pink and breezy Anna. An unexpected feature in that peasant maiden's conduct was that she had not as yet written to him, though he had told her she might do so if she wished. Surely a young creature had never before been so reticent in such circumstances. At length he sent her a brief line, positively requesting her to write. There was no answer by the return post, but the day after a letter in a neat feminine hand, and bearing the Melchester postmark, was handed to him by the stationer. The fact alone of its arrival was sufficient to satisfy his imaginative sentiment. He was not anxious to open the epistle, and in truth did not begin to read it for nearly half an hour, anticipating readily its terms of passionate retrospect and tender adjuration. When at last he turned his feet to the fireplace and unfolded the sheet, he was surprised and pleased to find that neither extravagance nor vulgarity was there. It was the most charming little missive he had ever received from a woman. To be sure, the language was simple, and the ideas were slight, but it was so self-possessed, so purely that of a young girl who felt her womanhood to be enough for her dignity, that he read it through twice. 4 sides were filled, and a few lines written across. After the fashion of former days, the paper too was common, and not of the latest shade and surface. But what of those things? He had received letters from women who were fairly called ladies, but never so sensible, so human a letter as this. He could not single out any one sentence and say it was at all remarkable or clever. The ensemble of the letter, it was which won him, and beyond the one request that he would write or come to her again soon, there was nothing to show her sense of claim upon him. To write again and develop a correspondence was the last thing Ray would have preconceived as his conduct in such situation. Yet he did send a short, encouraging line or two, signed with his pseudonym, in which he asked for another letter, and cheeringly promised that he would try to see her again on some near day, and would never forget how much they had been to each other during their short acquaintance. 4. To return now to the moment at which Anna, at Melchester, had received Ray's letter. It had been put into her own hand by the postman on his morning rounds. She flushed down to her neck on receipt of it, and turned it over and over. "It is mine?" she said. "Why, yes, can't you see it is?" said the postman, smiling, as he guessed the nature of the document and the cause of the confusion. "Oh, yes, of course," replied Anna, looking at the letter, forcedly tittering and blushing still some more. Her look of embarrassment did not leave her with the postman's departure. She opened the envelope, kissed its contents, put away the letter in her pocket, and remained musing till her eyes filled with tears. A few minutes later she carried up a cup of tea to Mrs. Harnham in her bedchamber. Anna's mistress looked at her and said, "How dismal you seem this morning, Anna. What's the matter?" "I'm not dismal. I'm glad. Only She stopped to stifle a sob. "Well?" "I've got a letter, and what good is it to me if I can't read a word in it?" "Why, I'll read it, child, if necessary. But this is from somebody. I don't want anybody to read it but myself." Anna murmured, "I shall not tell anybody. Is it from that young man?" "I think so." Anna slowly produced the letter, saying, "Then will you read it to me, ma'am?" This was the secret of Anna's embarrassment and flutterings. She could neither read nor write. She had grown up under the care of an aunt by marriage, at one of the lonely hamlets on the great Mid-Wessex plain, where, even in days of national education, there had been no school within a distance of 2 miles. Her aunt was an ignorant woman. There had been nobody to investigate Anna's circumstances, nobody to care about her learning. The rudiments, though, as often in cases, she had been well fed and clothed, and not unkindly treated. Since she had come to live in Melchester with Mrs. Harnham, the latter, who took a kindness interest in the girl, had taught her to speak correctly, in which accomplishment Anna showed considerable readiness, as is not unusual with the illiterate, and soon became quite fluent in the use of her mistress's phraseology. Mrs. Harnham also insisted upon her getting a spelling and copybook, and beginning to practice in these. Anna was slower in the branch of her education, and meanwhile here was the letter. Edith Harnham's large black eyes expressed some interest in the contents, though in her character of mere interpreter she threw into her tone as much as she could of mechanical passiveness. She read the short epistle on to its concluding sentence, which idly requested Anna to send him a tender answer. "Now, you'll do it for me, won't you, dear mistress?" said Anna eagerly. "And you'll do it as well as you ever can, please. Because I couldn't bear him to think I am not able to do it myself. I should sink into the earth with shame if he knew that." From some words in the letter, Mrs. Harnham was led to ask questions, and the answers she received confirmed her suspicions. Deep concern filled Edith's heart at perceiving how the girl had committed her happiness to the issue of this new sprung attachment. She blamed herself for not interfering in a flirtation which had resulted so seriously for the poor little creature in her charge, though at the time of seeing the pair together she had a feeling that it was hardly within her province to nip young affection in the bud. However, what was done could not be undone, and it behoved her now, as Anna's only protector, to help her as much as she could. To Anna's eager request that she, Mrs. Harnham, should compose and write the answer to this young London man's letter, she felt bound to accede, to keep alive his attachment to the girl if possible, though in other circumstances she might have suggested the cook as an amanuensis. A tender reply was thereupon concocted, and set down in Edith Harringham's hand. This letter it had been which Ray had received and delighted in. Written in the presence of Anna, it certainly was, and on Anna's humble notepaper, and in a measure indited by the young girl. But the life, the spirit, the individuality were Edith Harnham's. "Won't you at least put your name yourself?" she said. "You can manage to write that by this time." "No, no," said Anna, shrinking back. "I should do it so bad. He'd be ashamed of me, and never see me again." The note, so prettily requesting another from him, had, as we have seen, power enough in its pages to bring one. He declared it to be such a pleasure to hear from her that she must write every week. The same process of manufacture was accordingly repeated by Anna and her mistress, and continued for several weeks in succession, each letter being penned and suggested by Edith, the girl standing by, the answer read and commented on by Edith, Anna standing by and listening again. Late on a winter evening, after the dispatch of the sixth letter, Mrs. Harnham was sitting alone by the remains of her fire. Her husband had retired to bed, and she had fallen into that fixity of musing which takes no count of hour or temperature. The state of mind had been brought about in Edith by a strange thing which she had done that day. For the first time since Ray's visit, Anna had gone to stay over a night or two with her cottage friends on the plain, and in her absence had arrived, out of its time, a letter from Ray. To this Edith had replied on her own responsibility, from the depths of her own heart, without waiting for her maid's collaboration. The luxury of writing to him what would be known to no consciousness but his was great, and she had indulged herself therein. Why was it a luxury? Edith Harnham led a lonely life, influenced by the belief of the British parent that a bad marriage with its aversions is better than free womanhood with its interest, dignity, and leisure. She had consented to marry the elderly wine merchant as pis aller in the age of 27, some 3 years before this date, to find afterwards that she had made a mistake. That contract had left her still a woman whose deeper nature had never been stirred. She was now clearly realizing that she had become possessed to the bottom of her soul with the image of a man to whom she was hardly so much as a name. From the first he had attracted her by his looks and voice, by his tender touch, and with these as generators, the writing of letter after letter, and the reading of their soft answers, had insensibly developed on her side an emotion which fanned his, till there had resulted a magnetic reciprocity between the correspondents, notwithstanding that one of them wrote in a character not her own. That he had been able to seduce another woman in 2 days was his crowning, though unrecognized fascination for her as the she-animal. They were her own impassioned and pent-up ideas, lowered to monosyllabic phraseology, in order to keep up the disguise, that Edith put into letters signed with another name, much to the shallow Anna's delight, who, unassisted, could not for the world have conceived such pretty fancies for winning him, even had she been able to write them. Edith found that it was these, her own foisted in sentiments, to which the young barrister mainly responded. The few sentences occasionally added from Anna's own lips made apparently no impression upon him. The letter writing, in her absence, Anna never discovered, but on her return the next morning she declared she wished to see her lover about something at once, and begged Mrs. Harnham to ask him to come. There was a strange anxiety in her manner, which did not escape Mrs. Harnham, and ultimately resolved itself into a flood of tears. Sinking down at Edith's knees, she made confession that the results of her relations with her lover it would soon become necessary to disclose. Edith Harnham was generous enough to be very fair from inclined to cast Anna adrift at this conjuncture. No true woman ever is so inclined from her own personal point of view, however prompt she may be in taking such steps to safeguard those dear to her. Although she had written to Ray so short a time previously, she instantly penned another Anna note, hinting clearly, though delicately, the state of affairs. Ray replied by a hasty line to say how much he was concerned at her news. He felt that he must run down to see her almost immediately, but a week later the girl came to her mistress's room with another note, which, on being read, informed her that after all he could not find time for the journey. Anna was broken with grief, but by Mrs. Harnham's counsel strictly refrained from hurling at him the reproaches and bitterness customary from young women so situated. One thing was imperative: to keep the young man's romantic interest in her alive. Rather, therefore, did Edith, in the name of her protégé, request him on no account to be distressed about the looming event, and not to inconvenience himself to hasten down. She desired above everything to be no weight upon him in his career, no clog upon his high activities. She had wished him to know what had befallen. He was to dismiss it again from his mind. Only he must write tenderly as ever, and when he should come again on the spring circuit, it would be soon enough to discuss what had better be done. It may well be supposed that Anna's own feelings had not been quite in accord with these generous expressions, but the mistress's judgment had ruled, and Anna had acquiesced. All I want is that niceness you can so well put into your letters, my dear, dear mistress, and that I can't for the life of me make up out of my own head, though I mean the same thing and feel it exactly when you've written it down. When the letter had been sent off, and Edith Harnham was left alone, she bowed herself on the back of her chair and wept. "I wish his child was mine. I wish it was," she murmured. "Yet how can I say such a wicked thing?" Five. The letter moved Ray considerably when it reached him. The intelligence itself had affected him less than her unexpected manner of treating him in relation to it. The absence of any word of reproach, the devotion to his interests, the self-sacrifice apparent in every line, all made up a nobility of character that he had never dreamt of finding in womankind. "God forgive me," he said tremulously. "I have been a wicked wretch. I did not know she was such a treasure as this." He assured her instantly, declaring that he would not, of course, desert her, that he would provide a home for her somewhere. Meanwhile, she was to stay where she was as long as her mistress would allow her. But a misfortune supervened in this direction. Whether an inkling of Anna's circumstances reached the knowledge of Mrs. Harnham's husband or not cannot be said, but the girl was compelled, in spite of Edith's entreaties, to leave the house. By her own choice, she decided to go back for a while to the cottage on the plain. This arrangement led to a consultation as to how the correspondence should be carried on, and in the girl's inability to continue personally what had been begun in her name, and in the difficulty of their acting in concert as heretofore, she requested Mrs. Harnham, the only well-to-do friend she had in the world, to receive the letters and reply to them offhand, sending them on afterwards to herself on the plain, where she might at least get some neighbor to read them to her. If a trustworthy one could be met with, Anna and her box then departed for the plain. Thus it befell that Edith Harnham found herself in the strange position of having to correspond under no supervision by the real woman with a man not her husband in terms which were virtually those of wife concerning a corporeal condition that was not Edith's at all. The man being one for whom, mainly through the sympathies involved in playing his part, she secretly cherished a predilection, subtle and imaginative truly, but strong and absorbing. She opened each letter, read it as if intended for herself, and replied from the promptings of her own heart, and no other. Throughout this correspondence, carried on in the girl's absence, the high-strung Edith Harnham lived in the ecstasy of fantasy. The vicarious intimacy engendered such a flow of passionateness as was never exceeded. For conscience' sake, Edith at first sent on each of his letters to Anna, and even rough copies of her replies. But later on, these so-called copies were much abridged, and many letters on both sides were not sent on at all. Though sensuous and superficially at least infested with the self-indulgent vices of artificial society, there was a substratum of honesty and fairness in Ray's character. He had really a tender regard for the country girl, and it grew more tender than ever when he found her apparently capable of expressing the deepest sensibilities in the simplest words. He meditated, he wavered, and finally resolved to consult his sister, a maiden lady, much older than himself, of lively sympathies and good intent. In making this confidence, he showed her some of the letters. "She seems fairly educated," Miss Ray observed, "and bright in ideas. She expresses herself with a taste that must be innate." "Yes, she writes very prettily, doesn't she? Thanks to these elementary schools. One is drawn out towards her in spite of one's self, poor thing." The upshot of the discussion was that, though he had not been directly advised to do it, Ray wrote, in his real name, what he would never have decided to write on his own responsibility, namely, that he could not live without her, and would come down in the spring and shelve her looming difficulty by marrying her. This bold acceptance of the situation was made known to Anna by Mrs. Harnham, driving out immediately to the cottage on the plain. Anna jumped for joy like a little child, and poor crude directions for answering appropriately were given to Edith Harnham, who on her return to the city carried them out with warm intensifications. "Oh," she groaned, as she threw down the pen, "Anna, poor good little fool, hasn't intelligence enough to appreciate him. How should she, while I don't bear his child?" It was now February. The correspondence had continued altogether for 4 months, and the next letter from Ray contained incidentally a statement of his position and prospects. He said that in offering to wed her, he had at first contemplated the step of retiring from a profession which hitherto had brought him very slight emolument, and which, to speak plainly, he had thought might be difficult of practice after his union with her. But the unexpected mines of brightness and warmth that her letters had disclosed to be lurking in her sweet nature had led him to abandon that somewhat sad prospect. He felt sure that, with her powers of development, after a little private training in the social forms of London under his supervision, and a little help from the governess if necessary, she would make as good a professional man's wife as could be desired, even if he should rise to the woolsack. Many a Lord Chancellor's wife had been less intuitively a lady than she had shown herself to be in her lines to him. "Oh, poor fellow, mourned Edith Harnham. Her distress now raged as high as her infatuation. It was she who had wrought him to this pitch, to a marriage which meant his ruin, yet she could not, in mercy to her maid, do anything to hinder his plan. Anna was coming to Melchester that week, but she could hardly show the girl this last reply from the young man. It told too much of the second individuality that had usurped the place of the first. Anna came, and her mistress took her into her own room for privacy. Anna began by saying with some anxiety that she was glad the wedding was so near. "Oh, Anna," replied Mrs. Harnham, "I think we must tell him all, that I have been doing your writing for you, lest he should not know it until you become his wife, and it might lead to dissension and recriminations." "Oh, dear Mrs., please don't tell him now," cried Anna, in distress. "If you were to do it, perhaps he would not marry me, and what should I do then? It would be terrible what would come of me, and I am getting on with my writing too. I have brought with me the copybook you were so good as to give me, and I practice every day, and though it is so hard, I shall do it well at last, I believe, if I keep on trying." Edith looked at the copybook. The copies had been set by herself, and such progress as the girl had made was in the way of grotesque facsimile of her mistress's hand. But even if Edith's flowing calligraphy were reproduced, the inspiration would be another thing. "You do it so beautifully," continued Anna, "and say all that I want to say so much better than I could say it, that I do hope you won't leave me in the lurch just now." "Very well," replied the other, "but I thought I ought not to go on." "Why?" Her strong desire to confide her sentiments led Edith to answer truly. "Because of its effect upon me." "But it can't have any." "Why, child?" "Because you are married already," said Anna, with lucid simplicity. "Of course it can't," said her mistress hastily, yet glad, despite her conscience, that 2 or 3 outpourings still remained to her. "But you must concentrate your attention on writing your name, as I write it here." (6) Soon Ray wrote about the wedding. Having decided to make the best of what he feared was a piece of romantic folly, he had acquired more zest for the grand experiment. He wished the ceremony to be in London, for greater privacy. Edith Harnham would have preferred it at Melchester. Anna was passive. His reasoning prevailed, and Mrs. Harnham threw herself with mournful zeal into the preparations for Anna's departure, in a last desperate feeling that she must at every hazard be in at the death of her dream, and see once again the man who by a species of telepathy had exercised such an influence on her. She offered to go up with Anna and be with her through the ceremony, to see the end of her, as her mistress put it, with forced gaiety, an offer which the girl gratefully accepted, for she had no other friend capable of playing the part of companion and witness, in the presence of the gentlemanly bridegroom, in such a way as not to hasten an opinion that he had made an irremediable social blunder. No. In a last desperate feeling that she must at every hazard be in at the death of her dream, and see once again the man who by a species of telepathy had exercised such an influence on her, she offered to go up with Anna and be with her through the ceremony, to see the end of her, as her mistress put it with forced gaiety, an offer which the girl gratefully accepted, for she had no other friend capable of playing the part of companion and witness, in the presence of a gentlemanly bridegroom, in such a way as not to hasten an opinion that he had made an irremediable social blunder. It was a muddy morning in March when Ray alighted from the four-wheel cab at the door of a registry office in the S.W. district of London, and carefully handed down Anna and her companion, Mrs. Harnham. Anna looked attractive in the somewhat fashionable clothes which Mrs. Harnham had helped her to buy, though not quite so attractive as an innocent child. She had appeared in her country gown on the back of the wooden horse at Melchester Fair. Mrs. Harnham had come up this morning by an early train, and a young man, a friend of Ray's, having met them at the door, all four entered the registry office together. Till an hour before this time, Ray had never known the wine merchant's wife, except at the first casual encounter, and in the flutter of the performance before them he had little opportunity for more than a brief acquaintance. The contract of marriage at a registry is soon got through, but somehow, during its progress, Ray discovered a strange and secret gravitation between himself and Anna's friend. The formalities of the wedding, or rather ratification of a previous union, being concluded, the four went in one cab to Ray's lodgings, newly taken in a new suburb, in preference to a house, the rent of which he could ill afford just then. Here Anna cut the little cake which Ray had bought at a pastry cook's on his way home from Lincoln's Inn the night before. But she did not do much besides. Ray's friend was obliged to depart almost immediately, and when he had left, the only ones virtually present were Edith and Ray, who exchanged ideas with much animation. The conversation was indeed theirs only, Anna being as a domestic animal, who humbly heard but understood not. Ray seemed startled in awakening to the fact, and began to feel dissatisfied with her inadequacy. At last, more disappointed than he cared to own, he said, "Mrs. Harnham, my darling, is so flurried that she doesn't know what she is doing or saying. I see that after this event a little quietude will be necessary before she gives tongue to that tender philosophy which she used to treat me to in her letters." They had planned to start early that afternoon for Knowlesea, to spend the few opening days of their married life there, and as the hour for departure was drawing near, Ray asked his wife if she would go to the writing desk in the next room and scribble a little note to his sister, who had been unable to attend through indisposition, informing her that the ceremony was over, thanking her for her little present, and hoping to know her well now that she was the writer's sister as well as Charlie's. "Say it in the pretty poetical way you know so well how to adopt," he added, "for I want you particularly to win her, and both of you to be dear friends." Anna looked uneasy, but departed to her task, Ray remaining to talk to their guest. Anna was a long while absent, and her husband suddenly rose and went to her. He found her still bending over the writing table, with tears bringing up in her eyes, and he looked down upon the sheet of notepaper with some interest, to discover with what tact she had expressed her goodwill in the delicate circumstances. To his surprise, she had progressed but a few lines in the characters and spelling of a child of 8, and with the ideas of a goose. "Anna," he said, staring, "what's this?" "It only means that I can't do it any better," she answered through her tears. "Eh? Nonsense!" "I can't," she insisted, with miserable, sobbing hardihood. I didn't write those letters, Charles. I only told her what to write, and not always that. But I'm learning, oh, so fast, my dear, dear husband. And you'll forgive me, won't you, for not telling you before?" She slid to her knees, abjectly clasped his waist, and laid her face against him. He stood a few moments, raised her abruptly turned and shut the door upon her, rejoining Edith in the drawing room. She saw that something untoward had been discovered, and their eyes remained fixed on each other. "Do I guess rightly?" he asked, with wan quietude. "You were her scribe through all this?" "It was necessary," said Edith. "Did she dictate every word you ever wrote to me?" "Not every word. In fact, very little." "Very little." "You wrote a great part of those pages every week from your own conceptions?" "Though in her name." "Yes." "Perhaps you wrote many of the letters when you were alone, without communication with her?" "I did." He turned to the bookcase, and leant with his hand over his face, and Edith, seeing his distress, became white as a sheet. "You have deceived me, ruined me," he murmured. "Oh, don't say it!" she cried in her anguish, jumping up and putting her hand on his shoulder. "I can't bear that. Delighting me deceptively. Why did you do it? Why did you?" "I began doing it in kindness to her. How could I do otherwise than try to have such a simple girl save such a simple girl from misery? But I admit that I continued it for a pleasure to myself." Ray looked up. Why did it give you pleasure?" he asked. "I must not tell," she said. He continued to regard her, and saw that her lips suddenly began to quiver under his scrutiny, and her eyes to fill and drop. She started aside, and said that she must go to the station to catch the return train. Could a cab be called immediately? But Ray went up to her and took her unresisting hand. "Well, to think of such a thing as this," he said. "Why, you and I are friends. Lovers, devoted lovers, by correspondence." "Yes, I suppose." "More." "More?" "Plainly more. It is no use blinking that. Legally, I have married her. God help us both. In soul and spirit, I have married you, and no other woman in the world. Hush!" "But I will not hush. Why should you try to disguise the full truth when you have already owned half of it? Yes, it is between you and me that the bond is, not between me and her. Now I'll say no more. But oh, my cruel one, I think I have one claim upon you." She did not say what, and she drew her towards him, and bent over her. "If it was all pure invention in those letters," he said emphatically, "give me your cheek only. If you meant what you said, let it be lips. It is for the first and last time, remember." She put up her mouth, and he kissed her long. "You forgive me?" she said, crying. "Yes, but you are ruined." "What matter?" he said, shrugging his shoulders. "It serves me right." She withdrew, wiped her eyes, entered, and bade good-bye to Anna, who had not expected her to go so soon, and was still wrestling with the letter. Ray followed Edith downstairs, and in 3 minutes she was in a hansom driving to Waterloo Station. He went back to his wife. "Never mind the letter, Anna, today," he said, gently. "Put on your things. We, too, must be off shortly." The simple girl, upheld by the sense that she was indeed married, showed her delight at finding what he was, as kind as ever, after the disclosure. She did not know that before his eyes he beheld, as it were, a galley, in which he, the fastidious urban, was chained to work for the remainder of his life. With her, the unlettered peasant chained to his side. Edith travelled back to Melchester that day with a face that showed the very stupor of grief, her lips still tingling from the desperate pressure of his kiss. The end of her impassioned dream had come. When at dusk she reached the Melchester station, her husband was there to meet her, but in his perfunctoriness and her preoccupation they did not see each other, and she went out of the station alone. She walked mechanically homewards without calling a fly. Entering, she could not bear the silence of the house, and went up in the dark, where Anna had slept, where she remained thinking a while. She then returned to the drawing room, and not knowing what she did, crouched down upon the floor. I have ruined him, she kept repeating. I have ruined him, because I would not deal treacherously towards her. In the course of half an hour, a figure opened the door of the apartment. "Ah, who's that?" she said, starting up, for it was dark. "Your husband. Who should it be?" said the worthy merchant. "Ah, my husband. I forgot I had a husband," she whispered to herself. "I missed you at the station," he continued. "Did you see Anna safely tied up?" "I hope so, for 'twas time. Yes, Anna is married." Simultaneously with Edith's journey home, Anna and her husband were sitting at the opposite windows of a second-class carriage which sped along to Knollsea. In his hand was a pocket-book full of creased sheets closely written over. Unfolding them one after another, he read them in silence, and sighed. "What are you doing, dear Charles?" she said timidly from the other window, and drew nearer to him as if he were a god. "Reading over all those sweet letters to me," sighed Anna. He replied with dreary resignation.